Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. This video is a part of a series of videos where I count down my 10 least favorite or 10 worst episodes of all of Star Trek. In this video I'll get into my number 4 on my list, so getting into the top 5 here, so it's getting down to the really nitty gritty of what I consider to be the absolute bottom of the barrel worst of the entire Star Trek franchise. And my number 4 worst episode of Star Trek is Precious Cargo, which is episode 11 of season 2 of Star Trek Enterprise. So this is the episode in which the Enterprise comes across a crew of cargo haulers or whatever who say they're transporting a woman in stasis, but then they later find out that the woman is in fact being kidnapped by them for ransom, and she's like a high up royalty on her planet, and her and Trip get trapped together as they try to escape in an escape pod, and they end up on the planet while Archer and Enterprise search for them. So this episode is generally considered one of the worst episodes of all of Star Trek. It's not just me. Like, there's many episodes on my top 10 worst list which some people find controversial or they disagree with, or most people think is either good or not that bad. But this episode's not going to be one of them. I don't think I'm going to get much disagreement on this one. There was a Las Vegas convention, I believe, in 2012. It was a few years back where everyone voted on what were the 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, and this episode made that top 10 worst list. It is the number 6 lowest rated episode on IMDb, which honestly I think that's too high, especially considering the other 5 lower rated ones on IMDb actually aren't that terrible. Like Extinction and These Are the Voyages is the lowest, and Fortunate Son and Terra Nova, which, don't get me wrong, these are not good episodes, but they're nowhere near as bad as not just this episode, but the many others. There's like Singularity and Oasis. Like, there's much worse than those 5. So I think that I disagree with those IMDb. But anyway, regardless, it is considered to be one of the worst episodes of all of Star Trek. In fact, this was the first episode that was written by David A. Goodman, who was a writer showrunner on Futurama. He actually wrote the Futurama episode that paid homage to Star Trek, which features some guest appearances from the cast of the original series, and he said that that's probably what landed him his job on Enterprise. And after he finished his tenure on Enterprise, he actually became the showrunner for Family Guy. So quite an animated comedy guy. Now here's the thing. After he wrote this episode, he said that he thought he was going to get fired. Like, he thought that this episode would directly lead to him almost getting fired. And he does not like this episode. He admits that it was quite terrible. There was Brennan Braga, who had to rewrite this episode, and David A. Goodman does say that what appears on screen mostly was rewritten by Braga, but Braga described trying to rewrite this episode as struggling through it. He was trying to find the comedic voice there, but he just couldn't do it. And Braga himself said that this is definitely one of the worst episodes of all of Star Trek, and apparently Braga went to Rick Berman and asked if they could just not air this episode before it aired. Now, I got mixed feelings about Braga apologizing for this episode and saying it's terrible, because Braga seems to apologize for the wrong things. Or at least in this case, he's apologizing for the right thing. But he apologized for These Are the Voyages, which again, it's just a mediocre episode. It's not that bad. He refuses to apologize for the fucking theme song of Enterprise. He still to this day defends it and says that it's good and there's nothing wrong with it. And I'm sorry, but the theme song for Enterprise is the singular worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done. It's the singular worst thing. Like, it's worse than any of these episodes I'm mentioning. It's worse than the racism in Code of Honor. It's worse. Like, it is. There's nothing worse. It's even worse than the Star Trek 2009 reboot bullshit. It is the absolute worst thing the Star Trek franchise has ever done. So the fact that he won't apologize for it, that just makes me. I have no respect for the man because of that. But anyway, I'm sorry. I'm getting off on a tangent here. Regardless, so this episode is not viewed very, not even by the writers, not even by those who worked on the show, by the fan base. It's pretty well agreed upon that this is one of the worst episodes of all of Star Trek. Now, Enterprise, to me, see, I think that Braga and even some of these Enterprise fans would say that this is a terrible episode, and just single it out as like an isolated incident. And I would do that for, like, there's some other, like, great Star Trek seasons and great Star Trek shows. Like, there's an episode that will appear later on my worst list that was in a great season. It was in Deep Space Nine Season 6, which was the best, one of the best seasons of all the franchise. But they had, like, a couple of they had that really bad episode in that great season. And there's other examples like Next Generation Season 6 is also amazing, and it had Rascals, which was absolutely terrible. So you would have great episodes, great seasons of Star Trek, but then for whatever reason they just fumble in a couple episodes and they end up producing one really bad one. I want to make it clear that that is not the case here. If you're familiar with my channel at all, I covered all of Enterprise Season 2, and I did not like the season overall. I think this, rather than just being a rare example of the writers dropping the ball, I think this episode is actually really indicative of the terrible writing that was present in Season 2 of Enterprise, and Season 1 for that matter. But it got worse in Season 2. But it is the worst example, to be fair. It is definitely picking out the absolute worst of the worst, which is why it's on this list. But it's not out of place. It's maybe a little worse than some of the other bad episodes in Season 2, but there were a lot of terrible episodes. I mean, there were a couple good ones in Season 2, and those are the exception. Those are the rarity. Oh my god, actually a good episode. Usually it was either poor, like mediocre poor, or absolutely terrible. And this is definitely the shining example of that absolutely terribleness. So yeah, so I wouldn't really pinpoint and blame Goodman, really. It was just the whole structure, the whole writing structure that they had in place of Season 2 of Enterprise is failing, and it's not surprising that they produced crap like this. But anyway, so this episode, why does this episode suck so much, Mark? Well, why it sucks so much is because it's, and this is the thing with Enterprise. Again, this is why I'm saying it's very indicative of what the first two seasons of Enterprise are doing. Is that because it felt like almost every episode of these first two seasons felt like the writers didn't give a fuck. That they weren't even trying. And most of them would rip off, like, take ideas that were done before and just do it again, but to a lesser extent. Now here's the thing. I know I've heard this argument before, that while every story idea that you could ever have is already been done. Ever. So everything you see that's new is actually just repurposing something that's done before. Back even Shakespeare was repurposing other mythology and other story ideas that had already been done before. And of course, modern times, everyone emulates the fuck out of Shakespeare. So, which, that is true to an extent, but you can still craft new twists and original ideas and put different put it into different contexts, have different character revelations that make it fresh or make it original, even if it is like a tired idea. Like, for example, my favorite episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, Duet, was actually kind of repurposed from a play from the 70s and 80s about like a Holocaust survivor or someone, pretending to be a war criminal that wasn't. But to me, that doesn't diminish that episode at all, because it put its own twist to it. It's put its own original spin to it. It had amazing acting, tightly written dialogue, and just because it's emulating something that's good doesn't mean that it itself is going to be good. They have to put in an extra effort. Whereas with Enterprise, they have a lot of episodes that not only do they just emulate, they do a worse job at it. And it seems lazy, I think, is the biggest word, because that biggest adjective that best describes these stories, such as Oasis, for example, is that they, because it feels like they don't put the effort. It feels like they have another piece of text and they're like, oh, let's just do that again. And what they do here, it's like a copy and paste. It's like you have someone who's cheating on an exam and they get another exam paper and they just copy and paste it, and they not only fail, but if they get called out as a cheat and maybe suspended or whatever. And that's what it feels like these people are doing. They're just plagiarizing. They're just but doing a lazy job at it. You're just going like, okay, well, you got this character here who's a rich, stuck-up woman. She falls in love with a commoner, blah, 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 blah. Because the story has been done dozens of times before. There's the film Swept Away. There was a 70s version, which was apparently good, but I've never seen it. There was a 2002, so it actually came out roughly around the same time as this episode. I think a few months before this episode, there was a version with Madonna that was directed by Guy Ritchie, who was married to her at the time. And that movie sucked, like, really bad. It got terrible, terrible reviews. And then there's, I personally think of the movie Overboard with Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn from the 80s. I believe it was Kurt Russell, yeah, where there's this rich woman, like, got amnesia and she thought she was poor and married to this common guy or whatever. But the theme is basically the same, where you have this really high up, rich aristocracy, type woman who's, like, very privileged and she ends up being dependent on this common man who's poor or just like not ill-mannered or whatever, and because of that she ends up falling in love with him. Like, so it starts off with her being totally rude to him and treating him like shit and being like, oh, how dare you, you're just a common person, and it ends with them being like, oh, I love you. Like, that's a stupid idea to begin with. I'm sorry. I never saw the 70s Swept Away, but the other ones I mentioned I did not like. And keeping within Star Trek, there is an episode of Star Trek, the original series, called Alien of Troyes, which is slightly different, but it's basically the same thing, where there's this rich, stuck-up woman who comes on board and treats Kirk like shit, and eventually they end up falling in love, and the second half of the episode ends up being about how they love each other. Now, that episode has something to do with magical tears, which makes it slightly different, but it's the same basic concept. And it's also Enterprise. In particular, it has a tendency to rip off other Star Trek episodes. Other themes that have been done in Star Trek before, like the Oasis I mentioned, just ripped off Shadow Play, and there's another episode that came out around this one called Dawn, which is ripped off The Enemy, but that in turn was kind of taken from other films like Enemy Mine and stuff like that. So Enterprise, it seems like there was like a creativity vacuum in the writer's room of these first 2 seasons of Enterprise where they just could not come up with any ideas, so they just put in a DVD of something that's been filmed earlier and be like, well, let's just do that, blah, 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 copy and paste, and not even putting an effort to put any original fresh spin to it. And so this episode is actually decided, just to be clear on this episode is much worse than any of those examples, even the Madonna film. Yeah, I'm going that far because it's poorly written. The dialogue is terrible. You don't buy the character interactions with these characters. Like that in the 70s swept away. I'm sure there's a progression of the character, like she has a character journey through that episode. In this episode, there's no such thing as that. It's like, first of all, it's very poorly portioned. Like, too much of this episode actually is about, like, the cargo runners or whatever. And too much of it is taking place with them, like, going on the Enterprise and saying, oh, having dinner with Archer. And they're acting all creepy and suspicious the entire time. And then finally, they realize something's up. They're like, oh, excuse me, Captain, I gotta run back. And they just run out in the middle of dinner. And Archer, of course, is like, what the fuck's going on? And sends people after them. Like, way too much time is spent on that side of it, where by the time we actually meet Katama, I believe her name is, I don't care. But anyway, by the time we actually meet this character, it's like 20 or 25 minutes. It's almost like a third way through the episode where we actually meet this character. And then, of course, they get into the plot of her being like, oh, I am so high up, and I'm aristocracy, and I'm royalty, and you will not talk to me like that, you common man, blah, 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 and trip it. And also, I gotta be fair here, my own personal feelings of how much I cannot stand the character of Charles Tucker III, particularly in the first 2 seasons. And to be fair, like, yeah, I don't know. I talked about him extensively, but I really can't stand this character. And one of the aspects I hate about this character the most is how he's an idiot and he has no common sense. And they really accentuate that aspect of this character in this episode, shall we say. This like, it begins with him sitting in his quarters playing harmonica. I'm just like, oh my god, this is not starting good. And then it gets even worse when he's just like saying a bunch of stupid shit to Hoshi. And then finally when he meets the Katama, and she's being all stuck up to him, and he's just like, well, all right, you need me to survive, blah, blah, blah. And the comedy is just terrible. And it is hard to say that because it's written by someone who worked on comedy shows. Although, as I said, most of the episode was rewritten by Braga, who's trying to find the comedy. And I'm sorry, Brendan Braga is not a comedy writer. But anyway, regardless of whose fault it is, the comedy just does not work at all. Like, there's no comedy. Like, this episode is, I would say, the opposite of funny. And it's, it has it going against it that it's taking that same trope. And as I said, like, the structure of it is off. We just go very quickly. We spend way too much time with those cargo people, and then we have what's her face being really mean to Trip, and they're in this cramped shuttle pod. Oh, isn't that funny? They're in this cramped escape pod where he says, "Move your butt." He says "butt," and she's like, "How dare you!" I'm just like, oh my god. So anyway, they get down to the planet. And they're still being like, they fall there in like a swamp land, and she falls in the muck, and she's like, oh, how dare you, blah, blah, blah. And so they keep up the how dare you stuff for another, like, it's the second third of the episode. And then they kiss all of a sudden. All of a sudden they're in love, and then they get rescued by Archer, and it all happens really fast. There's no journey, there's no progression here whatsoever. And it's just, she's not in the episode, she's in the episode being a dick to Trip, and then all of a sudden they're making out, and then all of a sudden they're rescued, and then all of a sudden she's saying, oh, I love you, we're gonna visit each other, you can come visit me on my planet. They barely know each other. Most of the time they were together, they couldn't stand each other, and they just all of a sudden decided kissing just because they're of opposite sex, I guess. I don't know. It is just one of the worst written episodes I've ever seen, ever, and it's annoying. It's not that it's just the structure or the dialogue is poorly written. It's annoying. The actress who plays Katama is how do I put this? Not good. She's not good in this episode. She's not a good actress, and it is painful. I mean, I suppose it is possible that this dialogue could have maybe been tolerable if it was delivered by a good actress who knew what she was doing, but it elevates it even worse of how terrible her acting is. I do not buy a single solitary element of any of her deliveries whatsoever, and it's obvious they just hired her because she was hot, and that was the end of the casting director's reasoning right there. I doubt that they even had her read for the part. They probably just saw a picture of her and alright, hire her, she's hot. That's basically it. Now, I looked for shits and giggles. I looked up on IMDb this actor's previous experience, and IMDb page, I don't know if you've ever been there, will say what this actor is known for, and usually it favors movies. So even if it's I can't think of any specific examples. Maybe Peter Dinklage is one of them. But if you have someone who's most known for a TV show because he or she was the main cast member of that well-known TV show, if they were in movies, even if they had small roles, IMDb will favor the movies and put the movies known for. So it favors movies over TV shows. And it definitely favors bigger roles, even in TV shows. It will favor if you're a main cast member, even if that TV show wasn't that popular, it will favor that over if you just had a guest appearance in one episode. So what I'm getting at here is her IMDb page said known for Star Trek Enterprise, when she had a small appearance in one episode that most people think suck. So that tells you what kind of career that she has. And obviously she didn't have that many credits in her name, and I think there's a good reason for that, because she's not good. Not a good actress. Also, her IMDb page had a quote from her, where I don't have the direct quote in front of me at this very instant, but it was something along the lines about how, she was born in India and raised in Italy, and the India thing actually surprised me, but the Italy, I could tell, her alien language might as well have just been Italian. I know it wasn't actually Italian, I know it was a fictional language, just her accent was so heavy in the way she was speaking it, it gave her really strong Italian connotations to it. But anyway, she was saying, one of the quotes she says is that women or people in general are just more fit and better looking in countries like Italy and India, and that didn't really have any, and that's why people in other countries tend to be more ugly. And when I read that quote, I was like, yeah, that fits. I totally believe that she would say something like that. Anyway, so you have the poorly written, poorly acted dialogue. It's actively annoying. I mean, I already talked about how much I can't stand Trip, and you couple that, you turn his idiocy up to, I won't say Idiocracy, good movie, but you turn his idiocy up to 100, and you pair him with a bad actress and a poorly written role with a cliche plot, and you have one of the most annoying episodes to watch. I mean, this is one of the episodes of the franchise I've seen the least, to be fair, because I think when this episode first aired and I saw the preview for it, I'm like, I'm not watching that. But then later, when I was watching the entire, Enterprise from start to finish, I saw it for the first time, and I was like, yeah, this is just as terrible as I thought it would be, if not more. And then after that, when I did further rewatches, I purposely avoided this episode. So I think I'd only seen it like 3 or 4 times, which is why I did have to force myself to rewatch it for this. Now, I had actually seen this somewhat recently because I did a review. As I said, I did a review for Enterprise Season 2 where I forced myself to watch every single episode and give it a review and actually sit down and analyze it. And so it was kind of fresh in my mind this time I watched it. And so I watched it again, and it's just like, this is why I avoid this episode. It is pain. It is more so as probably, let me think of my top 3. Alright, other than, I'm trying to think what my number 3 worst episode is. But I would say other than my number 1 worst episode of the Star Trek franchise, this is probably the most painful episode of the entire Star Trek franchise to watch. Yeah, no, definitely more. I think my number 3 and 2 have like elements of so bad it's good, and it, which is kind of why I put it up so high, because I can't believe how terrible they are. But you almost like get jocular. It's almost somewhat like you get slivers of entertainment to watch it just because it's entertaining. It's funny how terrible those episodes are. Whereas this, in my number 1, like there's zero enjoyment, zero entertainment value to it. Whatever. It's not so bad it's good. It's just so bad it's annoying. You just want to. It's painful. It's like torture. You just want to fucking stop. And really. If you want to torture me, you want to get information out of me, strap me down, force me to watch this episode, and I will tell you my entire life. I will tell you any deep, dark secrets you want to know. Like, just make it stop! Anyway, sorry. So, yeah, so this is a really terrible... Okay, subplot. Gotta get in the subplot with Archer, because this is also stupid. I almost said equally as bad, but I don't think anything could be as bad as Trip's interaction with this aristocracy woman. Like, nothing is as bad as that. But it's pretty damn bad. And it's obvious that they're trying to play it for comedy. It was so dumb. Alright, because one of the alien kidnapper guys they actually captured on the Enterprise. And Archer and T'Pol were trying to get information out of him, but he wasn't talking, sort of to help them find Trip. So they put on this charade where where Archer was telling the guy, "Oh, we had, acting like they're under the thumb of the Vulcans, and they have very, very strict rules, and that like 6 people were like killed just for showing up late for their duty roster." And when T'Pol comes in wearing these robes, like Archer like bows and the other guy like bows along, and it's supposed to be all goofy and funny, and and T'Pol just like, "Oh, what are your measurements? What are your cultures, rituals concerning dead bodies and stuff like that?" to freak him out. And he starts freaking out and being like, "I'll tell you whatever I want to know." And, "Oh my god!" And Archer's like, "Look, I may be able to put a good word in for you if you're willing to give me some information." And it's so goofy. Like, this is one of the worst. Like, I want to say this is indicative of Braga, because I've seen several examples in later Voyager and in Enterprise that do this kind of thing, but this is actually one of the worst examples of that. It's something very like elementary, something very cartoonish about the no, tell me what you want to know, like having that scheme, which is like very obvious a scheme, and that this moron would be like, "Oh my god, you're gonna kill me." It's so dumb. It's not the least tiniest fraction of a bit funny. As I said, there's nothing amusing about this episode. It is just pain. Pain, I tell you. Anyway, that's all I gotta say about this piece of shit. My rating for Precious Cargo out of 10 is, of course, a 1. The worst, because this is the worst. One of the worst episodes. Definitely top 5 worst of the entire franchise. This is representative of season 2 of Enterprise, but granted, this is definitely worse than anything else in that season. But it's not an exception. But anyway, Terrible, terrible episode. So that is it for my review of Precious Cargo. I shall be back in a week for my top 3, getting into my top 3 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. If you would like to check out my top 10 worst series on the other videos I already did, the other entries in my top 10, you can check out a link in the description below that has the playlist, which will have all the videos I've done up to the most recent one. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please check out my channel as I review many more Star Trek videos, as well as doing many more videos and other shows like The Expanse and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.